The greatest march against homosexual marriage happened in France a few years ago. It's been 4 or 5 years now, where well over 1 million people gathered in Paris to say no.
Wow.
And that was French citizens, that was the Catholics, that was the Protestants, that was Jews. And you're like, wait, that's France, secular France? There were even, apparently, homosexuals in the crowd who said, I want to be free to do what I want to do in the bedroom, but if you recognize homosexual marriage, our society will fall.
Welcome back, everyone. Today, I am very honored to have Daniel Foucachon with me. Daniel, thank you for joining me.
Great to be here.
Let me do a quick introduction on you. So you got a bachelor's degree from NSA, and then you, as far as business goes, you have been the manager and media person at West of Paris, the restaurant.
Back in the day.
Back in the
It's
day.
been a while.
Yes, you are a board member and again the media person for Huguenot Heritage. You are a founding member of the Kepler Education, which is basically connecting classical Christian teachers from around the country. And
It's an online platform for classical teachers, but it's connecting them as well.
Yeah. And then you are the CEO and founder of Roman Roads Media, which whose office we are sitting in at the moment. And then you are, on top of all of that, a husband and father.
That's
so
right.
Thank you for joining
7
me.
kids.
Yeah. So first off, we'll start with kind of because you weren't born in America, correct?
Correct.
So you were born in France, and what kind of made your family decide to move from France to here?
So I was born in Aix-en-Provence, but moved away when I was 2. So I don't remember that part of France. Lived in Alabama and then Quebec for 8 years, some time in Florida, then back in France. Moved there when I was 12 or so. And then so all my teen years were in France until 19 when we moved here to Moscow, Idaho, to go to New St. Andrews College. So I guess the question is which move, but
Yeah.
The one that matters though is when we moved here to Moscow, it was the reason was New St. Andrews. I wanted a good education that would prepare me for life, and I thought I wanted a business degree. And so but I'd heard enough about New St. Andrews and classical education. I thought I'm going to do a year there.
We'll find out.
Get that classical foundation, and then I'm going to go get a useful degree at the University of Idaho. The integrated business program looked good, so I did a tour and all that. I was like, oh, okay, that looks great. After one semester at New St. Andrews, I decided this was the education I wanted, and said, I'm here for the BA.
For the full 4 years.
That's right.
Yeah. And then did your family move with you, or did they follow shortly after?
They came with me with the intention of only coming for a year.
Okay.
The idea of missionaries. So my father is a church planter and minister in France at the time. That was his 4th church plant. One of those was in Quebec, and he was overdue for what we call home ministry assignment. Basically a year of furlough where you come back and visit the churches that sent you, give reports, and then rest a little bit, prepare to go back, and then go back. So he thought he was just going to do a year, and as we settled in here, he realized, no, I think it's time for a more extended sabbatical from the ministry while my kids are going through college. He told me, I can't pay for your college education, but I can give you a job. And so that was the beginning of West of Paris, the French restaurant here in Moscow.
Yeah.
That we operated for 5.5 years. Enough time to get me in school, get married,
Yeah.
and then he's now returned to full-time ministry, but based here in Moscow.
Okay.
And that's Huguenot Heritage.
Yes. So as you were kind of, you were 12 when you were in France, and then you've been elsewhere around the U.S. What were the biggest differences you noticed between France and the U.S.?
Oh man. So the food.
I mean, yes.
There's a lot of ways you could take that, but the culture is very different. So let's on the you might say superficial side, but the things you would recognize right away. The life is slower in France. People do. They have vestiges of that Christian culture from centuries that gives a more family-centric life. Things not for conviction from reading scripture, but from tradition.
Right.
Things shut down on Sunday more so than in the U.S. There's more of a liturgy to life, a pattern. There's those famous long vacations. There's the different feasts, secular and sacred, that are still more or less observed, perhaps not for all the right reasons. And so there's a certain pace of life that's very different. But it has also become very secular. And therefore, that secularism has slowly crept in, and you therefore have the European context and different culture that affects us as well. But there is the ideas like Christian education, even among Christians, is a foreign concept.
Right.
You're kind of crazy to do that. We were the only homeschooling family. There was one secular family we knew of, but we were the only homeschooling Christian family in a city of 2 million.
Wow.
While we were there.
Wow. Good night. That's pretty radical. So then, where did that? You kind of talked about the underlying culture that they do things because of, even if subconsciously.
Right.
Where did that come from? Is that from the Roman Empire? Is that from the Reformation?
Yeah. So French. Well, I'll contrast it. America is far younger than I think we like to think about it. We've barely been around.
Have we? Is it we passed 250 years? Or are we almost at 250?
Well,
I think we're almost.
Yeah. Don't make me do mental math. I was homeschooled.
Yes.
So 1776. But I mean, obviously, it was America's. The Pilgrims landed before that. But there is. We're a young nation in the history of the world, and if you look at time periods of Europe, and you just kind of take the history of America and you superimpose it throughout French history, it's this little thing we give a paragraph to in some of our textbooks,
right?
And that's all of American history. So there's this idea of time. I forget who said it, but they were describing America as the nation that went from primitive to modern while skipping the time that actually creates culture, civilization. So if you think about Idaho in particular, you get a little bit different feel when you go to the East Coast, because it is older, people have been around, but especially here, you look at pictures from 200 years ago, and it's fields and settlers. So you go from survival, like we're surviving the winter here. The first settlers in Moscow they tried to ranch and they lost all their cattle the first winter. To here we are 200 years later, and it's modern.
Right.
We've got our roads, we've got our infrastructure and our fiber internet. And so what we have in France is that everywhere you turn, you see history. So I remember I was jogging from our house in France, and I looked at the side of the road, I was just jogging back roads, and I was like, oh, that's a Roman tunnel. Huh, I hadn't noticed that. I kept going.
Yeah. Yeah.
There was a wall that fell down near our house, and it revealed an old Roman aqueduct. Friends of ours, the Winces actually, who told us about Moscow back in the day, had a Roman aqueduct in their backyard that we would explore. These
Funny.
are 2,000-year-old structures.
Right.
And you dig in your backyard, you're like, oh, here's a 200-year-old bottle. We did that.
Yeah. Yeah. I think there's a famous saying in England that you shouldn't go digging because you'll find history.
Correct, especially if you're trying to build, because
stop
the
building. Stop and archaeology and all that.
This is now a museum.
Yes.
And so there is a real. I will sometimes be walking out, in Idaho, and I wonder to myself, when's the last time a human has stepped here? Ever?
Yeah.
And that's a legitimate question. I may be walking on a piece of land that no human has stepped in, or at least hundreds of years, maybe.
Right.
Way back. Where in France, you say, I wonder how many famous people have walked. So Roman Roads Press is named after the Roman roads of Europe, actually.
Okay.
And I grew up walking on Roman roads that were symbolized the spread of the gospel in the first century.
Right.
To my father always used the illustration of just as the Roman roads enabled the Apostle Paul to spread the gospel to the modern world at the time, he was comparing that to the internet, and that was kind of what gave me that idea. But it's like there's a very good chance that the Apostle Paul walked on this stone, and that's just so that is a different that changes how we view culture around us. This is
Right.
America is new, and therefore we tend to be more volatile. Even this affects, I think, our politics and how we the built-in conservatism that you have in France, whether they are doing it consciously or not. That tradition is a slowing effect. So they've come a long way, in a lot of bad ways, but there's been these vestiges that just slow everything down. And so you'll have things like the greatest march against homosexual marriage happened in France a few years ago. It's been 4 or 5 years now, where well over 1 million people gathered in Paris to say no.
Wow.
And that was French citizens, that was the Catholics, that was the Protestants, that was Jews. And you're like, wait, that's France, secular France? And that was not all those were not all Bible believing evangelical Christians, but it was French people who said the family is the building block of society. You take that. There were even apparently homosexuals in the crowd who said, I want to be free to do what I want to do in the bedroom, but if you recognize homosexual marriage, our society will fall. So you have that
an
aspect.
understanding of the consequences of those actions.
Correct, because they're standing on stones that have been there for thousands of years.
Right.
And I think it's a reminder of what society is and culture is that we don't really have here. And so even Christians here struggle more with understanding the implications of some of our culture building.
Yeah. So would you have America kind of slow down, or is this just something that we need to go through so that in 200 years, in 1,000 years, we can start to?
This is where I think education is important. What they understand intuitively, we need to understand philosophically.
Right.
And the American founders understood this very consciously. In their minds, they were Romans. And they were, Romans, Europeans, Christians. It's, all of this culture that came through Christendom and arrived, but they were very specifically not revolutionaries. They were very specifically not starting something new. They wanted to base it off of what was old. So they understood what they were doing. It's easy for us to forget, but we can go back to what the founders were doing and understand it's so essential for us to understand who we are and where we came from.
Yeah.
That's where classical education, the liberal arts are so essential to the Christians today.
You said that the founders were as Romans. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so this is kind of one of my favorite things to talk about. So,
Okay.
But I'd like to make the case, and I think I have a good reason to back this up, that that in order to truly understand who we are as Americans, we have to understand what it means to be Roman. And
Explain. I am lost.
So, first of all, I'll just kind of point at the American founders who it's said that George Washington had a copy of the Bible and one of Cicero's works on his bedside at all times. If you go to Washington, D.C., what you could look around and ask yourself, is this a replica of Rome? And it kind of is. All the architecture, all the symbolism. And you have George Washington was actually called the Cincinnatus of the West. Cincinnatus, we have a city named after it, Cincinnati, Ohio.
Yep.
Was a Roman from the 5th century BC who kind of embodied the ideal Roman. The short version of the story that he's famous for is he was known to be he was a senator. He was retired. He was well respected, and there was an attacking force on the city. And so in panic, they said, Cincinnatus, we'd like you to become dictator for 6 months, take complete control from the over the Senate. Just you're the king, you're the dictator, in order to crush the rebellion. He reluctantly accepted it. There's famous scenes of him like pulling him out of his farm from retirement to do that. And in 2 weeks, he had quelled the rebellion and then given power back to the Senate. And the reason they were so reluctant is that who gives power back? who does this? And so he was kind of emblematically the perfect virtuous Roman.
Yeah.
And George Washington wanted to be Cincinnatus so much that one historian, Carl Richard, Founders in the Classics, a great book I recommend, he thinks that George III's underestimating of the Republican ideals that the Americans held, because he underestimated how influenced they were by Roman thought, that's what made him underestimate them. And it was that desire to be Cincinnatus that kept him going through that winter. He wanted to resign his commission. All the language that George Washington uses, even his villa in the country, like, why do you call it that? He was embodying that Roman ideal. So that's an anecdote, but a very strong one.
It's interesting. Well, first off, the eagle from the Roman times, and then we go.
Oh, it's everywhere. It's everywhere.
Maybe coincidence, but it's an interesting coincidence nonetheless. But also the kind of, we see that idea, especially we saw it in COVID, of like the government, we're going to take control because because this is a crisis.
Right.
So we're going to take complete control and dictate your life.
Right.
Because and they unfortunately have been more reluctant to give it back in Cincinnatus. But still, we do see that idea of, okay, well, we're going to give someone who would not normally have complete control all of the power so that he can get us out of this crisis that we're in.
Right.
It's just an interesting, like, you wouldn't think of that unless it was something that had been thought of before.
Right. And the American founders were extremely suspicious of consolidated power, which is why what makes America unique is certainly not our democracy. That was the one thing the American founders rejected, pure democracy. So we use a democratic process, but we're a republic.
Right.
We're a Roman republic. We rejected the failed democracy of Greece, embracing the republican Roman idea of separated powers. So we have three separated powers that are meant to slow us down. Again, so I was mentioning kind of the slowness of conservatism. That's why I'm a conservative. It was Justice Anthony Scalia gave this famous talk about how they were very frustrated that they couldn't get things done. It was some hearing, and he gave his little opening statement that basically said that's how the founders designed it. The fact that we can't pass this or that, sweeping reform is how it's supposed to be. That's because our founders said, let's be Roman,
yes.
and Christian. James Madison, if men were angels, government would not be necessary. Men are not angels, you could continue, but men are not angels, therefore government is necessary, and let's limit government.
Yes,
because
the government is made up of men.
Is made up of men, exactly.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So then you moved to Moscow from France. And what was the first thing you noticed as you came in here? Was it that slowness? The lack thereof?
Yeah.
Was it the speed of...
No, actually, it was, you might say it was the lack of slowness compared to the East Coast.
Really?
So the East Coast tends to be Birmingham, Florida. My wife's from New York. Grew up in Montreal. So I'd mostly known the East Coast growing up. And it was a very materialistic, fast-moving culture. And Moscow, the first thing that struck me, that I just vivid memory, was the singing. And the singing at Disputatio at New St. Andrews, the singing at Matt Whitling's home with a bunch of freshmen just, hey, where's the contus? Hand them around, and they started singing. It was the singing, it was the worship, it was the life centered around Sunday, around the Lord's Day, that struck me. And it was actually its European feel compared to the East Coast that struck me more than anything else.
Yeah. Why is that? Because the East Coast is older than the West Coast, or at least much of the West.
Yeah, it's older. I don't know that. I think that part of what we're seeing here is the city versus rural is affecting it a little bit.
I'm sure if you went to San Francisco, it would also be
exactly.
Much
faster,
so
it's not a West Coast thing; it's a rural thing. So and I'm sure there's some parts of backwoods Louisiana that are slower.
Yeah.
But America as a whole does tend to be faster. And what we're seeing here is it was not specifically the slowness, but it was the more liturgical lifestyle and a slightly slower pace of life.
Yeah.
Is a part of that as well.
Yeah. Interesting.
Small town life.
Yeah. And then you got into media, how did that happen?
Yeah. So I thought I wanted to run some sort of import-export business when I was growing up. So I was always entrepreneurially minded. And when I was attending New St. Andrews, I was known for the guy that always had a camera. And the reason was, growing up in France, not being around the kind of community we have here in Moscow, I was constantly thinking, I got to capture this and I got to share it. There are people who are not here. I was one of those who would really enjoy seeing these, experiencing some of this vicariously, since they can't be here and I can't fly them all in.
Yeah.
And so I just started recording everything. Lectures. I'm pretty sure there was a new policy at New St. Andrews that developed because of me. A few things I did ended up being new policies. For example, you can't go on the roof anymore.
Really?
Yeah.
That's annoying.
Yeah. Some guy brought his who now my wife on the roof apparently, and now there's a rule. Oh well.
Yeah.
It's not.
Someone's got to make the rule.
And there. Forgot where I was going with that.
Well, I was just asking, like, how did you get into media?
Oh yeah. So
why did you?
Yeah. So I was recording things, and I was known for recording and preserving. After I graduated, I started a little media business. I was recording weddings, and then I started recording. When my first son was baptized, I went ahead and rolled the camera on the entire sermon and started putting up clips. It was a great sermon by Doug Wilson. And Rod Olps, who was an interim leader of Canon Press at the time, met with me and he said, what if we did this regularly? And thus was born Canon Wired at the time.
Yeah.
The new the media side of Canon Press at the time. The first comments as I put stuff on YouTube was, "Is that what Doug Wilson sounds like?" A lot of people had only read his stuff.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
I was like, it's kind of hard to imagine that today because the ubiquitousness of just media and video.
Yeah.
But over the next 4 years, I published 1,000 videos, and during that time, Canon developed their own media branch, and so I handed that back over after 4 years. But I had started Roman Roads Press because I had realized that there were a lot of curriculum options for just general Christian homeschooling that had developed over the last 20 so years, and some that was developed specifically classical Christian, but very little that was classical Christian and made for homeschoolers. So Roman Roads Press was founded with a specific goal of creating curriculum help for the homeschool family in particular.
Yeah, interesting. And was that more centered at the U.S. or people outside of the U.S.?
The U.S. I often get, English speakers. So we have U.K., Australia, Canada, obviously, customers, mostly the U.S. I often get the question, so you're making homeschool curriculum for France? And I say, well, as a business, it would be, I'm sure that I could get all the Christian homeschoolers in France in a room and they would really appreciate it, but it's not a great business plan.
Yep.
Not yet.
They
we
could
have
fit in
other
the room.
work. That's where it comes back to the Huguenot heritage work.
Yeah.
They are, there are too few homeschoolers to warrant major development for now.
So talking about Huguenot heritage, what is that, and kind of where did that idea originate?
So Huguenot Heritage is a ministry that my father founded to create materials to equip French pastors and laymen. And our main work has been as a partner to Third Millennium Ministries, which is based out of Florida.
Okay.
That was Richard Pratt is the founder and was one of my father's seminary professors at Reformed Theological Seminary in Orlando. So it's excellent material that they make. These are rich video, text, video, audio, seminary, master's level theological courses, and we do their French language translation
Okay.
and production.
Okay, nice. And where'd the name come from?
The third Huguenot heritage?
Yeah,
Oh,
Huguenot
yeah, okay.
heritage.
So Huguenot heritage, we are French. The Huguenots are the French Protestants from the 15 through 1700s in particular. They were the ones who were the French reformers. So John Calvin was
Yep.
a Huguenot, probably one of the more famous ones. And they were heavily persecuted during the 15 to 1700s. And to kind of go back to some of what we were talking about, France versus America, it was in large part the French Huguenots who left France due to persecution, came to the United States, and in setting up the United States, they essentially said never again. They wanted to give freedom of religion in a very specific way because they had escaped France. So
Yeah.
Paul Revere, Francis Marion. These were two French Huguenots that we should. The Patriot is very loosely based off the life of Francis Marion, so
Yes.
that would be the someone most people would be aware. But those are French Huguenots.
Interesting. Okay. And then back to media. Sorry.
Yeah.
We'll talk more about Huguenot
No, very
heritage
good.
in a moment. But back to media. Media has grown substantially, not just in Moscow, but around
Yeah.
the world from when you were in college.
Absolutely.
And then very recently, since kind of 2020, we've seen a transition from vertical to horizontal videos.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah. I think the reason is primarily due to where people are consuming it,
Which is your
so
phone.
yeah, so phone, it's horizontal.
Yep.
And it lends itself to shorter shorter attention span, you might say, but shorter videos. I don't dislike the vertical. I like creating content for vertical. I think it works. It's an effective way, but it is shorter, and it does mean you're not watching it on a larger screen. And so it has its place. And to kind of make a comment on technology as a whole, connected to that, I would say that the switch to vertical is to books what the tract was to the in like the 1600s. The tract played a very important role in the spread of the Reformation. So a tract was a single or couple pieces of paper that could be far more cheaply and effectively printed and distributed.
Yep.
And so the short form media I view in that same category.
Yeah.
That's not what you want all your media to be.
No.
But it is effective at distribution.
It's good in its place.
Mm.
Yeah. And media as a whole, how do Christians stand out, not only with the message, right, but also with the way they think about it, the way they produce it, the way they film it?
Yeah. Technology, media is especially its advancement. You could think of it as an accelerator. So a lot of people will talk about the good old days before social media, when where Dad was not on his phone, he was buried in his newspaper. So
Yep.
there is a sense in which it is more effective for both good and bad.
Yes.
And so I think Christians need to understand its power, but also its power for good as well as for evil.
Yeah.
And make sure they're using it for good things. So there are dangers.
Yeah.
But like anything, that if you give someone a very powerful car, they can do greater good and damage compared to a moped.
Yep. Is there a way that Christians can, not only in like the content they're producing, right? This is a fast car. Is there a way that Christians can Christianly produce the content, as far as like how they go about thinking about the storytelling, about the filming, about the editing, all of that?
Yeah. There's when it comes to Christian versus non-Christian media, often Christian has unfortunately meant low quality.
Yes,
And
I would
that
agree
is-
with that.
Yeah, and that is something that that's where something I want to see reformed.
Yep.
And so when it comes to Christians creating media, I think that the most effective thing they can do, as much as I'm a gearhead and I love gear and I love cameras and all that, the thing that a Christian should do is not go to film school and learn all about lighting, but they should learn about the world they're in, the how to tell a story, the best stories, what is a good story, which is why, maybe I'm biased as an alum, but I think the best preparation for any filmmaker is to go to New St. Andrews or a school like it. That'll immerse you in the great stories that form who we are. You're going to tell a good story if you know good stories.
Right. But it does help, surely, to go to film school and learn, okay, the way you light certain things can create certain...
Yeah.
Surely that's helpful.
I would disagree.
Really?
In that the film school, I have actually spoken, when it comes especially to film school in particular, this may not apply to every craft, but in film school, I've talked to graduates of Full Sail University, one of the most famous film schools, and they said that the most valuable thing they got out of film school was the introductions to filmmakers, which was a very expensive way to get introductions.
Yep. Yes, it is.
It's not that they didn't learn anything. It's that I don't believe they learned anything. They couldn't learn better.
On YouTube or something?
Just through experience, including YouTube. So if you want to see my film education, I don't consider myself a great filmmaker and aesthetically on the aesthetic side, but you could trace it. You go to those first videos from Canon Wired and you're like, wow, that audio is terrible. That you could see the progression. The very last ones I produced from the very first one. There you go. There's my education.
Yeah.
And I learned it from experience, trial and error, and just I'm teaching my own sons, and as I was mentioning before we started, I was out of town and my teenage son did his first solo and did set up the audio through rote memorization of just copying what I do, not understanding the principle of how audio works, and so he didn't place it in the right place, and so we had a great discussion about how audio works. It would have been very difficult, more difficult, I should say, for me to think through, for him to study in a book about how audio works and cram it and then just go and do it. There's education should be about teaching fundamentals with whatever field you're in, and then you go and you apply it and you learn it on the job. That's where the real practical education. So with a practical skill,
the school of hard knocks is when you get the real.
Exactly.
Okay.
Especially when you're dealing with craft.
Yeah.
It's I don't think that the classroom is the place to do that. I tell people often ask me what advice for this type of thing, and I tell them go out and film weddings. There's nothing better because there's no pause. Let's retake that. There's no you have to learn fast, and the stress level of what you're doing. If you're not rolling camera during the first kiss, you think about it. You're thinking about everything ahead of time because the stakes are so high.
Yes.
And, do it for free for a couple that wouldn't be able to afford it.
Yeah.
Start there and start charging. Doing weddings for free for friends where, it's okay. They were going to have nothing. So, the stakes are a little lower is the far superior than to spending, I don't know what it is, $100,000 a year now at Full Sail University. So don't go to film school. Go to New St. Andrews.
Interesting. Media, as we've kind of discussed, is a two-edged sword.
Yeah.
And so we've seen a rapid growth in the ability to share the gospel, to share helpful information and content that has helped people grow and in their not only their in their personal selves, but also in their abilities to do things. But we've also seen a lot of people glued to their phones.
Mm-hmm.
What is the solution to that problem? How do we keep what is good about media and discourage what is killing us?
Yeah. My example earlier of the dad who's in his newspaper versus his phone.
Yeah.
There's nothing new under the sun.
Right.
There's not. I don't believe there are truly new temptations. They're just maybe.
I agree.
More effective.
They're more effective and they're easier to come across.
Correct.
It's way easier to watch TikTok and be engrossed in that for 3 hours than it was to read a book for 3 hours.
Right.
You're by yourself,
Right.
consuming things for 3 hours.
Right.
But it's far easier and generally less beneficial.
Right.
To consume TikTok for 3 hours.
Right. And so I think but because it's not truly new temptations, they're just at a greater intensity. The antidotes are going to be the same as it would have been in the past too. I think having community, think about the people will often do this because they're escaping something. So accountability, community,
Yep.
People who are going to say, get off your phone,
Right.
Put down your newspaper. You've been buried in that book for a week straight. Come down and eat with the family. There's going to be I think the greatest danger of social media is not the social media itself, but the isolation that it enables.
Yep.
So people feel a false sense of community through living through vicarious relationships.
Oddly, I think that is also connected to the vertical form of content.
Interesting. Okay.
Because I see it as if you're consuming something personally, and oddly, this is like if you tilt your screen, two more people can fit on either side.
I had not thought about that aspect.
Than if you switch it this way, and it kind of incentivizes. I was actually talking with Lennox Calafangwa in Zambia about this, and it was like if you are watching something by yourself, you can hold it here, and it's on a small screen, right? You don't watch TikToks on your TV, right, and you're probably not going to watch movies on your phone. Right. You're going to watch movies on a laptop or something that's bigger, and size often indicates or at least draws community.
Right.
If
the
you're
bigger
watching
the screen, the more people are watching.
Right. If you're watching it on your TV, let's say you're watching a movie, suddenly you've got 3 or 4 other people in the room with you.
Right.
If you're watching a TikTok video by yourself on your phone because it's such a small screen, because you're not like you have to purposefully invite someone for them to come watch a TikTok.
Right.
There's not like you have to kind of look over their shoulder. It's awkward, right? You're far more incentivized to just I'm going to watch this by myself.
Right.
And it isolates a bunch of different people. I
hadn't thought about that aspect. And I told you I like the format. My experience with creating in that format has been mostly for business and ads, where you are trying to hit the individual.
Yes.
The more you're creating art to be shared, the less I would be inclined to say go with the vertical. That I had not thought about the individual. I like that.
Yeah.
And a good reason to create for longer form and horizontal.
Yeah. And it's also like, vertical video, you can only do a minute.
Right. Yeah.
And I was talking to Dane Wilson about this as well, and he was like, we need to I miss the days when people would like pull out their camcorder and film stuff.
Yeah.
And I called him a sentimentalist, but
I used to be the guy that carried around more or less his camcorder.
Yeah.
Actually, literally.
Yeah.
When we would be, I had a fairly small one. I grew up with the one on the shoulder.
Right.
And then so I had it, and that the benefit is that I was the only guy ever getting recordings, which it was a little more special. I remember, here's how old I am. I was embedding videos in my own little website before YouTube, and through manual coding, just like embedding in HTML, trying it out. It was all like trying to get it lined up. Flash, terrible. And YouTube came out, and I remember thinking, man, now my website, anyone could do what my website was special.
Yeah.
So, but what the other thing is, even though everyone has a phone, so few people take advantage of it at the right time. So like my video from the Psalm Sing Rest, now other people were filming there too, but, that got viewed millions of times, retweeted by President Trump. And I part of the reason I got that footage and it was a great view is that I've just had years and years of the habit of pulling out my phone and recording a moment. So I'm grateful for the small form factor, for the sheer ability to have it always on me. and the ability to actually capture it. I
Yeah.
would have loved that earlier on.
Yeah. I
But-
was talking to David Sharon. He was saying Sony came out with like a camera that's basically the same size as their phone, but it has like, it's a full frame sensor,
Ooh.
3/4 sensor or something, like a big sensor, and it's great. And he says I can just carry it around and hold it one-handed, and it works better than my phone, and it's a nice camera.
Yeah.
And it's super small. And he was like, I love this thing. So we're getting there.
Yeah.
We're slowly moving towards smaller and smaller cameras that have a good, like they produce good quality images.
Right.
But there are some people that have kind of, as the progression of individualistic watching, as the progression of TikTok and people spending more and more time on their phones, their reaction has been, okay, fine, I'm just going to throw my phone away.
Right.
I don't think that's the right thing to do. Would you agree with that, or would you say that sometimes that is the right course of action?
I would compare it to, I think that throwing your phone away is the right thing to do for some people in some circumstances. And I would compare it to a general good and blessing like wine. Wine is a good thing. We have it in communion. We have it at Sabbath dinner. It is a true blessing of God to be used to glorify Him. But someone who is the excess of wine is sinful, and so for certain periods of wine at 9 a.m. when you should be studying for exam is also sinful,
Right?
Or at least unwise. And so there is. I believe there are times where people should, because our culture is a drunkard culture. There are times where it's breaks, as well as if they're actually if I would not tell a drunken someone who struggles with drunkenness, here, let me have you over for some wine,
Right.
So if it has been a true stumbling block, that would be a reason. And even if it's not a stumbling block, I think there is room for because of how drunkard our culture is, to really use that analogy to push back at times. So I'm very much against the mentality of let's disregard technology. Let's throw it all out because as a reaction to this goodness. But that doesn't mean there's never a reason to do it. So I would want to be careful to leave room for people who are doing it for the right reasons. And I think the wrong reason is when people don't recognize the good it is, the blessing it is, the good they can do with it. And the ideal is that even if they do need to take a break from it, it's to come back and use it for God's glory all the more.
Yeah.
So it's not a I don't want to completely discourage the right person from taking a break or throwing it out.
Right. Yeah. How do you realize when that's you?
Community. Listen to the people around you, and if you don't have any people around you, well, there's a reason.
Yeah.
So if you are finding yourself a lot alone with
Or
your phone,
not with people who you respect or would look up to.
Correct. Yeah. So if you're using, then that would be a reason to be wary of it. And then if you do have people around you, listen to them. Assuming the people you trust, of course, parents, spouses, even children. And I've had to calibrate my own use.
Yes.
So it's important to be listening to those. And this is mostly going to affect younger people. Don't spend large amounts of time alone with your phone. I think that's unwise. Get out and be with friends, and then pull out your phone and film something worth filming.
Yes.
Also, I like to think of it in terms of create more than you consume.
Yeah. Yeah, no, this is true. I was listening to, I saw a quote the other day from Andrew Tate, who's a flavored individual, but he was like, there are only two types of people. There are creators and consumers, and you have to create if you want to be successful, if you want to live, if you want to, like, people who consume, it consumes them eventually. They are consumed. Right. The consumers are consumed, which is an interesting, it's true.
Yeah.
And the people who create, the creators are they are created.
Right.
Right. They flourish and grow as a result of that.
Yeah. When people talk about getting off Facebook, I like to kind of joke in response and say, well, I I get paid to be on Facebook. And what I mean by that is that it's part of my business and promoting my products. But the reactions are sometimes funny. Wait, what? And there is they actually this morning Facebook sent me a notification saying they want me to enroll to monetize my content. I don't know if I want to do it, but I was like, so I could technically be paid literally to be on Facebook, and that comes with all its own sets of dangers.
Yes,
because it can incentivize the wrong kind of viral content for the sake of viralness. That's another topic too. I mean, that's the TikTok phenomenon. You can be viral.
You can be
if you
viral.
Take off enough clothes.
If you take off enough clothes or act stupid enough.
Yeah,
like it's just no respect for your own dignity to an extent. And there's having fun, but then there's also just being a clown.
Right.
And you have to think, if you think 20 years in the future, you will often make better decisions than if you think about right now.
So when I say create, I don't mean create for the sake of creating something that is going to be viral, but create stuff that are worth creating, worth preserving, worth capturing, worth sharing, and there is plenty of that and plenty of garbage as well. So choose wisely.
There you go. We'll move on kind of to education and Kepler and Roman roads. So you started Kepler. What exactly is Kepler?
Yeah. So the motto of Kepler is empowering families by liberating teachers.
Okay.
And the principle there, so it is a platform for where teachers can list their classes. It's a free market platform. It will look like a school to the onlooker. We have grades, we have transcript service, we have end of year event, we have all the trappings of a school, except for one thing, which is basically the definition of a school. A school, at least a common definition, is a set curriculum. So Kepler does not have a set curriculum. We allow, we do organize the curriculum so there's a diploma track and all of that. So we standardize some things, but the teachers are the ones who, once they're approved as on the platform, and every teacher is classical, Christian, and conservative. Those are the three things you can know, and every teacher is vetted for that. But once they're vetted, they have the freedom to craft their own courses and even set their prices as well as when they teach. So there's a lot of teacher freedom. And what that does is it creates a platform that attracts some of the best teachers. So we have had hundreds of applications that have been too many for us to accommodate on the platform because the student body is still growing at a slower rate and than the teacher application. But the average teaching experience is our second year when we got off the ground and we calculated each one was 10 years of experience and a terminal degree. So these were experienced teachers who were saying, I get to teach. I've taught for 10, 15 years over here, but I was told what to teach, when to teach, and my income was a lot of work for a little bit of money. What Kepler does is it removes both the floor and the ceiling. We're not hiring teachers and saying, here's your class of 30 students.
Right.
We're saying, here, you list you
have the option.
You list your class. You make it attractive. You market yourself. We're going to also do a lot of help marketing you. You're going to be on the platform. You're going to be able to be searchable there. We're going to give you all kinds of things to help you do that. But ultimately, if you have a chance to fail, and we remove the ceiling, you can set your own price, your own time, and the way we do the flipped classroom means that there's far less of that teacher burnout syndrome, as well as student burnout through a lot of screens. So the vast majority of the classes meet once a week, and they have often video that they watch at home, and then they come to class. It's a far better use of the time versus meeting daily. And so the end result, and this is why we say empowering families by liberating teachers, is that parents have the choice that is very compatible with what homeschooling is. This truly is for homeschoolers, where parents are still deciding the teachers who are going to help them homeschool, and as well as the curriculum. And so a parent we might have 2 or 3 different, say, Latin curriculums, and so we might meet with a parent and say, what have they done? What's their temperament? We actually think that this teacher teaching this curriculum is better than this teacher teaching this curriculum, given your situation.
Right.
And that could differ by children, even in the family.
Yeah.
And so it's much closer to, if you go to any other online or brick and mortar school, there are excellent ones, but you're choosing the institution and just delegating to them. Here, my kid's ninth grade.
Do the ninth grade thing.
I'll write you a check. You give me the grade report.
Yep.
And obviously they want involved parents, but this actually leaves a lot of the pedagogical decision making, leaves it in the hands of the parents.
Yeah.
And is much more like the education of John Adams to his son, where he would hire tutors for his son.
What made you start this?
Yeah. So Roman Roads had a few classes that were that we had called it Roman Roads Classroom, that were just using our own curriculum, and I you might say I tested some of these principles of the flipped classroom and leaving a lot of teacher freedom, and it was going well, so well that it needed to either become its own thing, or I needed to find someone to run it. So we decided to incubate that Kepler. Kind of cut it off from Roman Roads. Roman Roads Classroom became Kepler Education, and make it its own thing and lean into the things that had worked well with Roman Roads Classroom, and wanting parents to be able to homeschool with who needed more than who wanted help from experienced teachers,
right.
but didn't want to give up what they loved about homeschooling, the flexibility. The choice of curriculum and all that. Not that long ago, you had to choose. Well, first of all, there were no Christian schools, or very few. And then when there were, so homeschooling was in many cases the only way to give your kids a Christian education. And then Christian schools developed, but you had a choice of a 5-day brick and mortar school or solo homeschooling. And as time goes on, I see that the solo homeschooling is becoming more and more rare. I can't think of one person that solo homeschools. And a lot of the caricatures we have of homeschoolers come from the solo homeschooling days.
Right.
That was the only thing that was available. And all the weird jokes about homeschoolers being awkward come from those, and they're
true.
they're true. But that has more or less disappeared, to the point where even institutional schools are becoming more like homeschool, which I'm a great supporter of the hybrid model. The university model school, and Kepler's kind of leading in that. So what was lacking in the market was a platform for both on both the teacher side and the home and the parent side. Parents, the ability, they need help, but they don't want to give up that freedom. And the teachers were the ones who surprised me the most. I thought they were the ones who were going to need some convincing, and we basically put it out there, and it spread like wildfire among teachers. And they're like, there's a place where I can actually have freedom as a teacher,
right?
Within parameters, of course, but that was Kepler. So we've done very well there.
Why is the education, we've talked about this before, not only connected to Huguenot heritage, but also connected to the cultures of France and America, and that distinction between Europe especially and the West, and the West being America? Why is education so important? Yeah.
When I go to a homeschool conference and I'm talking about to someone who's not very familiar in the American context, why classical? They look at our stuff and they see a bunch of Greek and Roman education, books, the Homer's Iliad, and as a Christian, they may say, "Why are you reading these pagan epics? How does this help me be a better Christian?" and all that. My 30-second pitch to someone who's just kind of walking by our booth and said, "Classical, what does that mean?" is to say this is the education that the American founders gave their children in order to prepare them for what they were doing in America.
The colonization.
The founding of America, our Constitution, what we know as you might call the American experiment. So it's not that the founding fathers happened to be classically educated. They were, but they attributed it to their to to the founding of America, to their ability to do what they did in America.
Right.
John Adams wrote. I was reading through the letters of John Adams, and I found a letter to his son that we've published at Roman Roads, and I've talked about a lot. That where he says, his son was 17. And he said, we're about to go. This was right around the founding of America. President of the United States to a future president, saying that there is no better way to prepare you for the stage of life for your place in the stage of life than to, and in this case he was specifically talking about the writings of Thucydides. Now, if one of the founding fathers believed that the writings of Thucydides was essential to prepare his son for the context. Now, this is not, Thucydides is someone who was not a contemporary of his age. This was someone who was far more ancient, so
Thucydides is Old in Greek.
Oh yeah, Old in Greek. Most Americans, if you say Thucydides, and they go, no.
I do not, in fact, know.
Yeah. So Thucydides is still read by every graduate of West Point. It is Thucydides wrote the history of the Peloponnesian War, and he was the first political realist who talked about not only history but history as human nature. He wrote his history saying, "This is a great war, but I'm mostly writing because I want to write about the nature of man when he goes to war." So there is if our founding fathers felt that was essential to being an effective person on the stage of life, as he put it, and yet the average American has never even heard of Thucydides, much less read Thucydides. It's required reading at New St. Andrews. Although he said, go read it in Greek, but I also have some translations. So we've fallen way behind. But the reason I founded Roman Roads and then Kepler Education is that I wanted to give families, both for their kids and for themselves. A lot of parents use our curriculum, our Great Books curriculum in particular, to understand why they should be conservative, would be one way to put it.
Right.
So that thing that I talked about in France being more intuitive because they're standing on ancient ground, where we don't have that as much because we're a young country. It's all the more important to do what our founders said we must do for our own kids, and receive this, what we now call classical Christian education. But for centuries, that was just what education was.
Just an education.
And education, if we're talking historically, education is what we now call classical Christian education.
So did you always realize that education was so important? Or did this kind of hit you at NSA?
So I received a traditional Christian homeschool. My high school diploma is from Christian Liberty Academy, satellite schools class, and it was a good traditional education, but it wasn't classical. I did 1 year of classical school in France because my dad started a ACCS school, a classical school in France. And so that's partly why I wanted to do that first year at New St. Andrews. I had enough of a taste to realize it was worth doing. But I didn't fully understand until I had experienced the idea of education as formation versus training. So that's what I fully understood at New St. Andrews. But the thirst started earlier.
Yeah.
The thirst started and I was not the kid who was the nerd. I was, a matter of fact, I've never been anywhere near the dean's list in all of my education. But I was inspired by a few teachers in my high school years, and the ones who really lit a fire were the ones who were introducing me to Virgil's Aeneid, my favorite book, and which I make the case is could be understood as the founding myth of America.
Yes, I would agree with that. Actually. Yeah.
And very few people think of it that way. But and then Milton's Paradise Lost.
Okay.
So those two works. But there is so the Virgil's Aeneid. I think is particularly relevant to Americans because uh, it it um, uh, it defines that Romanness that gives us so much of our what it means to be an American. So the idea of patriotism comes from the Romans. The idea of destiny, the idea of duty, of piety, of
Yeah,
pietas,
honor.
of honor.
Yeah.
Those are very Roman ideals,
Yeah.
and we tend to assume they're universal, but they really aren't. They are
Yeah.
very American, very Roman.
Right. Why is it that we've kind of forgotten the influence of education, especially in America, and kind of handed it over to the government?
There's
Well, let me ask this as well. Is it that we forgot about its importance, or did we just never know it?
we forgot about it. We did know it. It was only 100 years ago that a lot of this was still an integral part of our public education system, and I think the way we forgot it was that we were a Christian nation that became secular over time, and therefore our public institutions used to be Christian institutions, and and so they were taken over by secular ideologies that undermined all of that. And so there was a period that the interestingly aligned with segregation in the schools, where the great books were removed, because the great books were a unifying principle even in our education, and their removal meant that there was it had an ununifying effect, a segregational effect on our schools. There is a book by I'm blanking on her name, Prather, Dr. Prather, and this is about racism in America, but it explores the role of the great books in dividing America, the removal of the great books in dividing America at a crucial point, and going back in time even to the like Washington, who, slavery was still in existence. There was actually a lot of unity as he was giving a great books education even to his slaves.
Yeah.
So it's a fascinating thing to see how it was removed from America, but with its removal, with the removal, we forgot over time. But I believe that it happened. The greatest shift happened on December 7th, 1941. The bombing of Pearl Harbor, so wartime, immediately created the suspension, temporary of course, of the college entrance exams. So if you've seen like Anne of Avonlea, you've seen the long exams that they portrayed in that film. Those were week-long exams that really tested you on what you knew on Western culture. You had to know your Homer, you had to know your Latin, you had to know your great books to enter college. And that was the advent of those were suspended, and they introduced the new SAT system, essentially, the bubble test. One of those inventors was Dr. Frederick J. Kelly, who invented the bubble test based on the Army intelligence exams, and this was looking not so much for knowledge but for potential for intelligence, and also had racist origins because they believed that people of color were less intelligent intrinsically, that they were, and therefore they were going to keep them out of all the Ivy League schools by having this intelligence exam. He refuted his own work. He said it was flawed in its base, and spent the rest of his career trying to undo the damage of what he viewed as a distortion of education that we have brought in with the advent of the SAT and the College Board. So uh, uh, he was exiled of sorts to, what do you do with a distinguished academic who has done a lot but you don't want him around? Well, let's give him a position out west, like, president of the University of Idaho. And so he became president of the University of
Really?
Idaho in 1928 to 1930. He didn't
That's
last
funny.
long here because he was he was wanted to put in a thoroughly classical curriculum at the U of I, and they didn't. The
weren't
progressive
fans.
movement was already moving in a different direction.
Yeah.
But his inaugural address, the University in Prospect, 1928, was gave the principles of classical education in that address that are fantastic. I've published part of it, and so this was the guy who was kind of at that edge of calling it out, saying, "Hey, this is bad," and I even had a hand in it. But this is not a good direction. So that was 1928, early 1900s. That's where we started to go astray, and a lot of it came through our testing. You teach to the test. So I've been on the board of academic advisors for the CLT, the Classic Learning Test.
Mm-hmm.
And part of why I did this research is I wrote a chapter of their launch book on the history of the SAT, and I thought I knew what I was going to write about, and then I ended half a shelf of books later, I realized, whoa, this is heavy stuff.
Yeah.
And there's
a lot of history here.
There's a lot of history here, and it's darker than I thought.
Yep.
And that's why I kind of give it that date of wartime hit. And we shifted our educational model to, we got to make it to the moon. We got to emphasize STEM. We need scientists who are going to make bigger, better bombs faster. And our entire education system went from, our definition of education turned into training, and training for being a cog in society, versus training as the formation of a human being, which is what it was for all of human history before that. So America played a role, unfortunately, in that shift, and so pushing back against it is not just saying we need to add arts, like a lot of people are saying it's not STEM, it's STEAM. You add the A in there for arts, and I generally think that those who are talking about it that way, I can sort of agree in one sense, but I don't think they're going in the right direction. We have to go back to what is education, and I think that if you look up education, you're not going to get the definition that Chesterton gave, and I think Chesterton was much more accurate. He said education is merely the soul of a society as it passes from one generation to the next. And if you look at what we do in our schools and our curriculum, and how the United States, think about how that shift happened with World War II. If you think about what we've done with education, and then realize, how Chesterton was defining education, you realize that it's not about adding arts. It's about fundamentally redefining and revaluing our understanding of what education is for. Most people believe it's to train for a job, and that's just simply not the purpose of education.
Interesting. Yeah. And is that where Kepler and Roman roads come in?
Correct. So that's the classical Christian education, and those are ways to equip families. So Roman roads produces curriculum to allow families to receive. So our motto is inherit the humanities. We believe that. I love the word inherit because it assumes that there is something to inherit and that you have to actually receive it.
Mm-hmm.
So it's there for the taking, but you have to
you have to go
receive
get it. Yeah,
you have to go get it. And so we produce curriculum for families. It's curriculum that can be used either on your own, but the best way is as a family, because it's video based, horizontal, not vertical. You can watch these lectures in the center of the home. Don't put on headphones and go up to your room. Let's bring it to the center of the home. Parents and younger siblings can be involved with it. And then Kepler is a way to bring expert teachers to actually help with the load of the recitations, the teaching, the grades.
Do you see any way in which the public schools can be redeemed?
Yes and no. I don't believe they can be redeemed by fixing them, propping them up. I think they need to crash and burn first.
Okay.
And
Interesting.
then and I don't think it'll look like public education when it's rebuilt. I think that there's a lot of good people who I don't believe Christians in just about every circumstance should be putting their own kids in public education.
Yep.
The younger, the worst.
Yep.
But I also appreciate Christians who are willing to teach in that environment, and
Yeah.
it's almost unsurvivable now. And in most cases, my advice is get out.
Yep.
Obviously get your kids out, but also if you're a teacher,
There's
way
no
to go.
purpose.
I mean, that this ship is going down, and it doesn't mean that there aren't people you can help on the way down.
Yeah. No,
But it's going
absolutely.
down.
Yeah. But you have to realize the situation you're in.
Yeah.
Yeah. And is the answer for that, like in your ideal world, would it just be homeschooling?
No, so this kind of goes back to what I mentioned about traditional brick and mortar and solo homeschooling. Doug Wilson wrote a Educators in Residence Substack a little while ago that there was one part I really agreed on, and then one part I disagreed on. He said the important thing is Christian education, whether it's brick and mortar, homeschooling. We can sort that out later. And amen.
Yeah.
I agree. The part I disagree with is that by the time we sort it out later, I think they will be more similar and almost indistinguishable, meaning that homeschooling is benefiting from some of the structure of traditional schools, and traditional schools are moving away from the Prussian 5-day model more and more and becoming more like homeschools as well. So the families being more integrated into it, the chasm in between it is somewhat disappearing. So I think down the road, and this is already happening fast, we're going to see more university model schools. And it's like, are you? So we actually have this when we're doing sales, we're trying to figure out, is this a school or a homeschool co-op? And the answer is often gray, because because they often look very, very similar. And so there is a huge growth in like 2-day model schools. And so are you homeschooling if you're spending 3 days at home? Parents are involved, but they still have teachers and grades and assemblies and all the trappings of a school,
Yeah.
but it's a hybrid. ACCS now accredits
Yeah.
university model schools. Is that homeschool or is that a private school? I think there's going to be more and more of that. So I think
Yeah.
the real danger is to solo homeschooling, but almost nobody does that. That's a straw man.
But at the same time, isn't there also a benefit to, especially for high schoolers, learning how to, maybe less for kids,
Yeah.
12 and under. But once you get to junior high and high school, I would say there is a benefit to 5-day a week school that's like 8 hours long as a practice for a job.
Right.
Because when you get to a job, like if you've lived your whole life and you only have school for 2 days, well, equivalent school to work.
Right.
And most of your time is spent, playing around, or I'm going to go build a shed or something.
Right.
And then you have to go into a job where it's like, you may not like the job system of 5 days a week for 8 hours, but that's the way that it is.
Right.
I
Yeah.
think there is a lot of value in 5-day a week, 8 hours a day,
Right.
as training for this is what real life
Yeah.
is like.
Well, do you know why schools K through 12 only, because no other school education system does this? Do you know why K through 12 schools are 5-day?
You mentioned the Prussian model.
Right. Well, I'd put it a slightly different way. Mom's got to work.
Yes, that's also true.
Right. So,
Unfortunately.
in other words, we've imagine if what would happen to society, and there would be chaos if you did this magically. So,
Yeah.
I'm not advocating this.
Right.
But imagine if every 5-day school turned to 3-day school. I think the result would be, first, a lot of chaos. You'd probably lose some kids back to public school, just who were there for convenience in the elite model versus true conviction. And the households would become more important in society. The building block of society would actually become the building block of society. Right now we have, I think, an overemphasis on church, family, and school, with school pulling a lot of that aspect of culture, and it's not a black and white thing. There's a lot of good there, and they are filling a lot of people often bring up, well, what about single moms, things like
Right,
that.
right, right.
And there's some
Yeah.
good things. I'm not advocating that
but
5-day
fringe
schools
cases
go
do
away.
not make
Exactly
the law.
Yeah, so just imagine that scenario. Every 5-day Christian school in America goes to 3 days. I believe that after some rearranging and some chaos, households would have had an incredible growth in their importance in culture.
I would agree with that, but where I think I would find a problem is if you are a high school kid who, like, because even if, like, you're going to go to NSA afterward, NSA has this as basically a 4 or 5 day a week. You at least have one or two classes, and then you're expected to have a job on top of that. And if you're spending 3 days a week in school, like, this is hard learning, right? And then the rest of it is kind of, we expect you to be on top of it and expect you to watch the videos and read the books.
Right.
I think that you will have, people will be less equipped to go into a 5 day a week job, where it's like it is
Right.
5 days a week. It is 8 hours a day.
Right.
And even if schools shouldn't necessarily be preparing us for that,
Right.
like training us to be a cog in the system,
Right.
there is an extent where, like, if I'm going to be, providing for my family,
Right.
I need to know how to work for 5 days a week for 8
Right.
hours straight.
Right.
And I need to have practice doing that, so that when when it's 2:00 on a Thursday afternoon and you don't want to do this anymore, you have the willpower to continue moving forward.
Right. I do think you're right that a 5-day model does prepare kids for 5-day work weeks.
Right.
And I think that is that is intentional. And if I want to push it really strong, just for the sake of controversy, diabolical. So,
Explain.
Yeah. So the 5-day work week is a system that is very modern. We've not 5-day work weeks is new in the history of the world. It is I don't believe it's that our schooling system has been crafted to feed that model that creates a kind of serfdom in our entire society.
Yeah.
So it's not that it's wrong to work 5-day work week at all.
Right.
That there is a lot of but that structure, that 8 to 5 aspect, is not creating free people as an overall cultural norm. So the norm shouldn't be the 9. I don't believe should be the 9 to 5. The where you go into an office and again, there's lots of good things there, and there's lots of good businesses that run in that way. But that's I don't think that there's any correlation to like you mentioned, New St. Andrews. I've actually spoken to New St. Andrews professors, and the New St. Andrews is not a 5-day or even 4-day. It's by class. We base Kepler off of it. You have it's a 2-day system per class, so you're working 5 days a week.
Right.
But
you see your teacher 2 days, and then you see a different teacher
him on
for
Tuesday,
another Tuesday,
and then you have a recitation on Thursday per class. So when you the students who struggle the most at New St. Andrews are with that. There's freshman year, you have the homeschoolers, because it's about 50-50 at NSA, homeschooler versus private. You have the freshman year, you have homeschoolers who have a sharp learning curve on a lot of just classroom type stuff that they didn't get. So the 5-day schoolers typically skate through freshman year, and then it gets really tough, and the freshman student the homeschool students struggle with some of those kind of cliche things people stuff, and then they tend to have an easier time once they've gotten over that learning curve for the rest, because there is a lot of freedom offered all of a sudden. So you're in a regimented system on bells and class periods in high school, and then suddenly you have all this freedom
Right.
in all of a sudden. And for a homeschooler, they don't have that kind of transition. Now, when it comes to the workplace, I have what the 5-day model do is it does get you used to a certain regiment, but it's a regiment where you are learning to work within a system. And I would point to the statistics of valedictorians who have basically perfectly embodied the 5-day system, who statistically don't do well in life, in their jobs. They don't do poorly, but they don't excel. Just statistically, it's not a death sentence if someone's a valedictorian, of course. But if you the valedictorian tends to be the person who just mastered that 5-day system. They know how to work it. And in life isn't like those 5 days. And it's not the place that tends to create the entrepreneurs, that tends to create the leaders, that tends to create the creators. So it does help them go 9 to 5. But in our culture, I think that 9 to 5 is going away. By every year, it's becoming less relevant. The 9 to 5 provides less. The 9 to 5 enslave. I mean, Red Balloon is all about helping people get out of all these 9 to 5 jobs. Now, of course, it may put them in another 9 to 5 jobs, but often.
But it's being free at work from ideologies being shoved down your throat.
One of those ideologies, though, is I think in the huge picture. One of those ideologies that's harder to identify is this entire view of work and what we're for that has a connection to education.
Interesting. So I'd love to know, like, why do you say that the 9 to 5 system is bad? Because in the Bible it talks about like a 6 days you shall work.
Yeah.
And then
6 days you shall labor
and do all your work.
Yeah.
Right. But the 7th is a rest.
Right.
And the 9 to 5 model, like, I would say it is good to have some structure to your life.
Right.
But where would you say that goes too far in the 9 to 5 model?
Well, I would say the structure depends on the job you do. So if you're a farmer, do you have structure? Absolutely. You have seasons, and you're working 12-hour days or more during the summer, and then in winter, so you have structures based on seasons. It's certainly not 9 to 5, and that's a whole industry.
Yeah.
In other words, the 9 to 5 only applies to a certain industrial industry that for most of the history of the world was very small. If you're a blacksmith, it's kind of 9 to 5, but
you worked from dawn to dusk. Basically.
Yeah, dawn to dusk, and you had a shop, and you had to take days off where you depending on the type of shop you ran.
Yeah.
But so it's more industry specific.
Right. Are you advocating for more of you have like
you want an education that prepares you for work, learning how to work well and be faithful, versus a specific kind of industry, which is what our 5-day model cultivates.
Right. But since not everyone is going to be a farmer, are you advocating for a work week and for an education? Because the education flows kind of from that.
Right.
Are you advocating that you should not? It's not about 9 to 5. It's not about hours. It's about how much you get done.
Yeah. So in my case, I have never received a traditional paycheck in my life, and once I had the closest thing was when I was working at the restaurant, and I technically got a W-2, but that was all tips anyway. There was once someone I was doing contract work for, and I was producing video content, and they wanted to switch me because it's part of the system they were overhauling from a stipend for what I was producing to hourly. Can we put you on the clock? And this was a period where I was learning so fast, so much. Every month that went by, I was producing more content that was higher quality and spending less time on it, and investing in my own equipment to do so.
Right.
And I told them flat out, no way. Why would you disincentivize me to I would stop all innovation, stop all learning.
I agree with that. Where people I'm just going to go to work and do the 8 hours.
Right.
Just to do the 8 hours. Right. Checking the box just to check the box.
With my own sons, I want to try to always separate their attaching a value to their time and instead attaching it to what they can produce. And I think the 9 to 5 cultivates you are worth your time instead of what you create and what you can accomplish.
But to an extent, like you were saying, like we are limited by our time, and you were like,
Right.
I was learning so much and I was producing better content in shorter time period.
Right.
Right. So surely like your time becomes more valuable, and that's how you, because we ultimately, all of us measure our days as days.
Right.
All of us measure our, like everything we measured is by time.
Right.
Right. How successful has your business been? How long has it been around?
Yeah.
Right. And so everything is measured by time. And so surely you want to become your hours to be more valuable, as opposed to the products you make becoming better, even if, because the products you make becoming better, I think, is integral to your time becoming more valuable. I think those
Right.
two go hand in hand.
Yeah. It's not, obviously there's some correlation there, but even, even then, how does, I am entirely in favor to talk about some current news, in Elon Musk getting his $55 billion payout. Part of the controversy there is that he basically told the board, you don't pay me a cent if I don't accomplish these goals, but if I 10x the company in 10 years, I think it's what it was, then I and along with some things along the way, then I want to have this kind of payout, but I get nothing if I don't produce it.
Right.
And
that's what you're aiming for?
Well, that kind of mentality is the kind that says, I would say that that's the kind of mentality that is based on what you can create and produce versus the time. I mean,
work to do versus a job.
Right, work to do, but also he did manage to do, at the time people laughed at it. It was like, that's impossible. In order for him to do that, he'd have to game something. They're like, no, it's ungameable. And like they were ridiculing him for it, and then he accomplished it.
Yeah.
And now they're trying to take it away because they say he's too much.
Yeah. Yeah.
But he 10x'd the company.
Yeah.
And and so that's a whole controversy. I think he should get that because he actually produced.
Yeah.
So that kind of mentality is not fostered. Do you want children who are going to think in terms of that kind of thinking of what I can produce, or I put in the time. So yes, it has a correlation to your time. Elon Musk sleeps on the factory floor and gives his life to this thing. He puts in time.
Right.
But there's not a constant clock of like, now my time's worth this much. He doesn't think. People will actually say Bill Gates makes, I don't know what it is, $20 million a minute or whatever it is. Is he making $20 million a minute? I mean, it's sort of in a reductionist way, but he is. He's created something that's creating something that's creating something, and so you can kind of pull it back to he's making $20 million a minute.
Right.
And so I want my children to be thinking of, even now in young things, what in terms of what they produce, and it doesn't mean I don't pay by the hour and there's not plenty of time. I do. Yeah. But I want to get them thinking about how, even when they're paid by the hour, it's more about what they're producing.
Yeah. As we close up, I'm sure we could talk about this more, but
Yeah.
I've got to go. What would be the number one piece of advice you would give to people?
Number one piece of advice. Would be to read your Bible and read the great books. I know that may be kind of cliche for a Christian and an educator to say, but I mean it. If you're reading, be a reader. So we are people of the Word. We should be people of words. We should be people of books.
Yeah.
You need books in your house, the Bible being the first one, and you need to be reading those books. So a society that is valuing the Word and reading the Word of God, as well as the great books that shaped who we are going to understand their place in the world, where the world is going. And when things like COVID hit, they know the nature of mankind and are equipped to deal with it with wisdom.
Yeah. Where can people find you on the internet?
RomanRoadsPress.com for Roman Roads. I actually have a personal website I don't keep up very well, Foucachon.com, if you can spell that last name. And then Kepler.education for for the work we do with Kepler. That's now led by Scott Postma, and he's doing a great job. But if you want to get a classical education for yourself, we have tools at both Roman Roads and Kepler. There's adult classes at Kepler as well, micro classes that are very accessible. The Old Western Culture is our most popular with adults. There's a Great Books Challenge for adults. We have over 2,000 parents who have been going through it.
That's fun.
And so if you want to receive that education for yourself or your children, check us out.
There we go. Thank you for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, appreciate it.